segment. It's a question and answer time. And so, Brother Mac, if you don't mind, come right on up here. So just ask you a few questions about missions and things. And yeah, we can use that, and then also
Okay.
we have a pulpit there to work with. I'm so glad that you're here, part of our conference. And I think if I remember right, the first conference you were at Central, I think that was the first big conference that they did.
Mm-hmm.
And if I remember right, but so it's been, so know a little bit about your work, and what would you say as we get started thinking about missions? What's the big problem in missions? Why isn't there more people saved around the world?
Wow. Well, if people are not coming to a saving knowledge of Christ, it's because for one reason or another they're being influenced by something else. And, you know, for instance, in Africa, I would say it's because the culture itself is based on animism. And animism, in and of itself, I mean, if you get right down to the roots of animism, they are in fact demonic. And so that really opens the door to a lot more activity on the part of the devil, a lot more influence in that way. And so, you know, that can become very difficult for somebody who is steeped in animism to come to a saving knowledge of Christ. They really have to be convinced of it. So I think, you know, one answer to that question is just the simple fact that there are many other religions in the world and many other influences in the world that impede people coming to a saving knowledge of Christ. I think at the same time we can recognize that we really haven't sent enough missionaries. You know, it's easy for us to feel like, well, the task is just too great. I mean, God's asking too much out of us, 7 billion people, and He's asking us to reach them. That really is very unrealistic. That could never really happen. But the reality is, if every Christian won one person to Christ each year, just one person, we would attain the world's population in 34 years. It doesn't seem like that'd be the case, but if you do the math, it will. The first year you have 1, the second year you have 2, the third year you have 4, the fourth year you have 8, and it continues to double. You'll attain 7 billion by the 34th year. So I think when we look at it that way, we can realize one Christian per year, one person per year, maybe it's not such an unattainable objective, you know? And so I think we have to allow ourselves to shrug off, you know, the negativism and our bad conceptions concerning God's calling and all those things, and say, hey, this is a positive thing. God wants me to give in the gospel. I can give it out. And if I win one person each year to Christ, that means I've fulfilled my role for winning this world in 34 years. And so, you know, I think those are some of the things. Definitely the world's religions and the world's concepts, they impede people in accepting Christ. We're not getting enough people out there because I think we have negative conceptions and we're kind of fatalists and we think, well, we could never get it all done anyway. We allow that kind of thinking to go on in our minds. And yeah, those are all things I think that are resulting in not seeing the number of people saved that we really would like to see. Mm-hmm.
Right. Now, in tonight's message, you talked about spiritual warfare.
Mm-hmm.
I think for the average American Christian, they would think, well, of course, the devil is out there, but, you know, if you're saved, that means you're safe from the devil. The devil can't really get to you. Mm-hmm. I don't believe that, but I think a lot of people think that. Mm-hmm. Here in America, many people have like some kind of an evangelical type background. Mm-hmm. So I think because of that, it may not be quite as obvious as to how the devil works. Mm-hmm. Now there in Africa, it sounds like where you are, am I right in assuming it's more obvious, the devil working in people's lives and in the culture?
Absolutely. You know, again, here in the States, we come from a Judeo-Christian ethic, at least in our origin and in our beginning years. Unfortunately, as a country, we're getting away from that. But still, you know, basic understandings about one almighty God, about sin always being wrong. You know, it's always wrong to lie. Of course, we rationalize it, but, you know, we're not supposed to do that, those kinds of things. That's already inbred, as it were, in our culture. Even our legal system is Judeo-Christian in its basis. And we as Americans, we're rugged individualists. We're very concrete in our thinking. If you're going to tell me that this causes this, then as an American, I want to see the mechanism by which that happens. And if you can't make that connection for me, then I'm probably not going to believe it. That's how we are. The entire continent of Africa, in one way or another, its culture is based on animism. And in animism, if there is one Almighty God, if there is, He has long since lost interest in what's going on here on this earth. So as an animist, I don't have to concern myself about one Almighty God somewhere. What I do have to concern myself with is the spirit world that's around us here. And those spirits are comprised of my ancestors and other spirits, evil spirits, and they very much are affecting what's happening here on this earth. So as an animist, I live my life in an effort to placate those spirits so that they never do anything bad against me. Then they'll take it one step further and they'll say, if one of those spirits decides to inhabit an inanimate object, then in their minds that spirit has animated that object. Thus the term animism. It comes from the Latin word to light. So I have an idol, or maybe even out in nature, a tree or a mountain or something, and I believe that a spirit has inhabited that object, then for me, that object is animated, and I'm going to worship it because of the spirit that is inhabiting it. So that's like the theology of animism. Now, that theology establishes practices, that here in the States, perhaps the word voodoo would be a word we would understand a little bit better. Fetishism is the technical term. In other words, if all these spirits that are around us are having an effect on what's going on in this life, maybe there's something I can do to get them to do things that would be favorable for me. So I'm taking that theology now and I'm putting it into a specific practice. So I'm going to see the person that specializes in this. The English word would be witch doctor, I guess. The biblical word would be sorcerer. And I'm going to find out from him what I have to do to get these spirits to help me to have children, to help me to get a job promotion, to help me, have the victory over this guy over here or whatever. And, the scriptures tell us, Paul said to the Corinthian church, if you're worshiping idols, you're really not worshiping those idols, you're worshiping devils. And we know from our theology that if there are spirits that are there, they're not the ones that are doing things on this earth, that would be demonic in its nature. So those practices have opened up the door completely to demonic activity. And again, it's very foreign to our Western thinking, but up until this point in time, we have had blocks that have kind of prevented that from really entering into our culture. But in an animist culture, that door is so much more wide open. For an African, per se, you can say that this is what causes this, and they don't have to see the mechanism. They don't have to see it. So we would refer to them as being very superstitious. But if we understood everything that had gone on in their experiences, we may not view that as much as superstitious because they have experienced things. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, certainly. I mean, we deal with that out there, and unfortunately, the typical American missionary that ends up in Africa hadn't had 5 minutes of training on animism, and so he's going to have to learn it on the fly. And good luck with that. There's very little that's written about it. Right. But sure, absolutely. Okay. I have seen things in West Africa that I have never seen in the United States.
Now, you mentioned that this idea of animism is kind of a basic theology for most of the African culture. Yeah. And I know that many religions kind of adapt to the culture to some degree. Mm-hmm. So on the surface, what are some of the religious influences that we'd be more familiar with? Okay,
that we'd be more familiar with. Well, the ones that are successful are the ones that syncretize with animism. And that may be intentional, it may not be, but in fact, if the word syncretize means mix with. Right. Those that are willing to mix with animism or are willing to tolerate animism, they're the ones that are successful. So that would include, for example, the Catholic Church. It's kind of the running joke in the Ivory Coast. When the Catholics first came to the Ivory Coast, all the Ivorians renamed their ancestors after the apostles so that they could pray to them. It's just kind of funny to think about, but that's what they say, There is much in Catholicism that has similarities in animism and in animistic practice. So Catholics don't have any problem. You can be a good animist from Monday to Saturday and then be a Catholic on Sunday, and there's no conflict, there's no misunderstanding, there's no shame. Islam syncretizes with animism. I'll never forget the day a Muslim asked me what we Christians called our witch doctors. I said, man, you're not getting it. We're all over on the one side. Yeah, I mean, and he was shocked by that. I said, we don't do that at all. We preach against that. We don't believe that that's what the Almighty God has done. You know, because a Muslim witch doctor is referred to as a marabou, and you know they're plentiful enough there in the Ivory Coast. The charismatic movement, absolutely. As a matter of fact, when we were starting the church in Bangerville, the city hall asked me to go around and see all my neighbors, because we started the church in my home, and he wanted to make sure that neighbors weren't going to have a problem with it. So I went around and saw all my neighbors. And I have a couple that lives catty corner to me. Wonderful people, they really are. He got his PhD in education in Quebec and worked for the Ministry of Education. A very smart guy, very, very intelligent. And I explained to him about our opening our church in our home and how we would be quiet. We weren't going to use a sound system, no tom-toms. You know, they didn't have to worry about the noise, and it would be temporary until we had church land and a new site and everything. And you know, he eventually said, "Well, if that's the way you do it, you won't have a problem with me." And so I went out from there. I said, "Well, you know, what kind of background do you have with church?" He said, "Well, when I was a kid growing up, we were Catholic." I said, "Oh, so you're a Catholic?" He said, "Oh, no. I haven't been in Catholic church since the day I married." And he was in his 50s then. And I said, "Why?" He said, "Oh, it's dry. Nothing to it." So I said, "Well, do you have any other church experience?" He said, "Yes, I have a colleague who goes to the Foursquare Gospel Church, and I've gone there a few times." And I started laughing. I said, "Wow, you've really hit the spectrum there, because Foursquare Gospel is about as whacked out as you can get on the charismatic side, and then you have the Catholic Church here." I said, "You've really done the spectrum. What did you think of the Foursquare Gospel Church?" And this is what he said to me. He said, "To me, the charismatic movement is nothing more than West African animism using Christian terms." Now that is striking, an amazingly striking statement. So those religions that are willing to mix with or integrate with or tolerate or accept animism, they're flourishing, absolutely. So much so that typically if we want to get into a village in our area, they'll never let us in if all we're going to do is evangelize. We have to come in with some type of something profitable from a human perspective for that village. If they don't, they won't let us come in, because they know we're going to preach against animism. We're going to call them to repentance from that religion. So that's how it is.
So with, I know the Great Commission includes seeing people saved, but the Bible doesn't say how we're to go about doing that.
Right.
And obviously it's going to be a little different in different places, because people and cultures are different. So what are some things that you've done to be able to try to give out the gospel?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, we started our church there in Bangerville, and that was personally my first church planting experience. And we started out the ways that we typically do. We got out on the streets, we handed out tracts. John and Romans talked to people. John and Romans are very effective because the people simply will not throw them away. They can't. There's too much there. And we handed out so many of them. Eventually got to the point where you'd go to give it John and Romans, and to somebody in our town, they'd say, "Oh, I already got 3 at the house." So they're very effective. And we talked to them about the Lord, and that reached a certain segment of society. And so after about a year, I began looking around, and I'm realizing we are only effectively reaching a certain segment of society. Obviously, no Muslims. No strong animists from the villages around Bangerville. And Bangerville is a huge school town. We can have 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 students a year that come from the interior of the country, and they stay in dorms to go to junior high and high school. And all the kids in our church at that time were coming with their parents. We weren't getting into those dorms and effectively evangelizing them. So I challenged our men. I said, "Listen, we got to find ways to do this, okay? Because we've got to get the gospel to everybody in this town. And so think with me." And the men in our church came up with options. The first was a man who suggested using literacy to reach the Muslims, because he said, "Listen, illiteracy in the Ivory Coast is in the immigrant Muslim population. The Ivorians are very, very serious about education. In my church, a lot of them have college degrees, although unfortunately it's not doing them a lot of good. They have them. I would say that most of the people in my church have arrived at least a 10th grade education. So they're very serious about that. But 25% of the population in the Ivory Coast is immigrants. And most of those immigrants are Muslim, from Senegal, from Niger, from Burkina Faso, from Mali, from Togo, from Ghana. So that's where you find illiteracy in the Ivory Coast. So if you open a literacy center, you can know the vast majority of the people coming to your center are going to be Muslim. And that's the case. And so for 20 years now, we've run this literacy center. We now have 300 students in it, and we've expanded it to where we can get you, in night classes, we can get you through a 10th grade education. But, you know, what's homework in our literacy center? You have to go home, you have to read this Bible passage, you have to read the questions about that passage, and you have to write out your answers to those questions. So, I mean, these Muslims, every year we hand out awards for who does the best in the homework, and every year it's a Muslim who's winning the way. And believe me, he knows the gospel at that point in time. They get it as a part of their homework, they get it as a part of their testing, they get it as a part of a man who's up there preaching it to them. And once they've attained a certain level, they have to start doing the Source of Light Bible study materials in order to be in the literacy center. So we are getting the gospel to the Muslim community there, and many of them have come to Christ. For the animist, what really seems to work in the villages is the medical. That really seems to work in the village. You go into a village and offer free medical help with medicine, and I'm telling you what, they're going to let you do what you would like to do. And so we started that around Bangerville. We ran a clinic from 2004 to 2010, and then we seeded that back to the government, but we have a nurse practitioner that works with us, and she is still out in those villages. We're getting ready to start a new clinic soon out in the Grand Basalm area. But if you come into a village, we'll go into a village, and for 4 or 5 days, we'll do medical days, and we'll treat anywhere from 1,200 to 1,500 people. And every one of those people will have received a one-on-one gospel presentation. It's not just that we preach to them and then we help them. We do preach to them at the beginning. They go from the waiting room to triage, and then from triage they see their doctor. From their doctor they go to the counseling room while their prescription is being filled, and then that's brought to them after the counseling is over with. We'll have 30, 40, sometimes 50 of our church members that are counseling one-on-one in that room. And then all those pieces of paper, all those questionnaires, all the follow-up on every one of the patients that we saw will go to that local pastor, so he has those materials to follow up with. Excellent in the villages. And it gets, you know, there have been times where certain of the villages around Bangerville have wanted us to stop coming, and the chief has said, well, okay. But if they don't come anymore, that nurse practitioner doesn't come anymore either. It's like, oh, well, okay, all right. So they'll put up with it a little bit more. For the teens, for the youth, sports just really works well because there are no sports teams with the schools. So your average kid growing up will never play organized sports. It'll just be whatever they do in the street. So there is a basketball federation and a soccer federation. They're both in with the Ministry of Sports with the federal government. It is not hard at all to open a center and to run that center. You'll get the students coming in. They want to participate. Every one of our players has to work his way through the Source of Light Bible study materials. And again, a man getting into the ministry in our church is responsible to follow up on all those players. Luke grew up in that center from the very beginning all the way to the end. And so those kids they're getting the gospel. And so these are ways that we found to be able to reach people that we weren't effectively reaching just through regular, evangelism. Mm-hmm. And it's been good. In a third world country as well, it really raises the stature of that church. In Bangerville, if you ask somebody, what real churches do you have in this town, they'll say Catholic, Methodist, Baptist. Because there are tons and tons and tons of fly-by-night churches, or they're just so whacked out that the general population itself doesn't really understand them. But I mean, we've come into that town, we have a basketball center, we've affiliated with a soccer center, we have our literacy center that's there and operating. We do those medical days, we had the clinic before, and in the eyes of that population, that's a real church, which helps in the sense that if one of our members speaks with them, they'll take that far more seriously, because in their minds, that's real. So it's helped in that way as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, for the medical clinic, I think there's obviously a different cultural aspect of what the significance of that. Because around here, we can go to the hospital, we got multiple hospitals, multiple walk-in clinics that we can go to. What is medical care like for the average person in the village?
Wow, in a village, that can really be difficult. In other words, they're going to, if it's serious, they're going to have to get up and get transported out of that village and get to some type of city where there's what we refer to as a municipal hospital, which is why the villages are so open to healthcare coming in.
Right, and
It's
is
just
that,
amazing to watch.
is that even possible for most people to get to a major center?
Well, they can if they have loved ones. They'll work that out. But imagine that you have 103 fever due to malaria, and you're exhibiting all these other symptoms. And now you got to get thrown into a car and go over a dirt road for say 20, 30, 40 miles to try to get to a city to get into that hospital. And those doctors are not being compensated per patient. They're simply drawing a salary from the government. So for them, they're going to get that same salary if they treat one person or if they treat 50 people. So better that it would only be one. So there's a lot of intolerance there between the doctor and the patient. As well, the Ivorian doctors feel absolutely no need whatsoever to ever explain to the patient what the problem is. The patient's just supposed to come in and answer his questions and keep his mouth shut and take the medicine the way he tells them to take it, which runs so contrary to our culture here. But that's the way that it is. So medicine over there is oftentimes a very difficult experience, because the person may or may not have confidence in that doctor, and if he doesn't, there's no way he can dispute it because that doctor's not saying anything to him one way or the other. Is this medicine actually working or not? There's a lot of corruption. Triage is often dependent on money that's being given. It's a very difficult circumstance. For us as missionaries, there is a private healthcare system there that we can avail ourselves to, which actually is pretty good in Abidjan. But we have insurance, and we're able to do that. My people could never do that. Mm-hmm. So the public health care system really is very, very, very challenging, very frustrating.
Right, so for just the average person in the village, to be able to come to, I think it's a free clinic, to be able to go, that could be a life-changing event.
There is not a doubt, Pastor, that we have done medical days where people have come and we've absolutely saved their life on that day. There's no doubt about that, number one. Number two, we'll get a lot of people coming through the line who are saying that they're sick, but we know that they're not really sick. But we accept that. Why they're there is to get a hold of medicine because they know that one day they will be sick with that, and then they will not be able to get that medicine. And so we have a lot of tolerance for that. They'll come through and, oh, my head's just killing me, this is killing me. We're looking at him, the guy's as healthy as he can be. Okay, all right. We'll go ahead and give that to them with those directions because we know what they're going to do is they're going to take it home, and then when they do drop down with malaria, they'll have the medicine that they'll be able to take at that time. Right. Just not to be gruesome, but we had a circumstance with a man in our Bingerville church that got hit by a taxi on Wednesday. I didn't know about it till Thursday. I went in on Thursday and they had done nothing for him. He had compound fractures in his legs. He was missing skin from where he'd hit the pavement. They had done nothing for him. I tried to move things forward. They went ahead and did some x-rays, but they wouldn't do anything for him because I was there. They were waiting for me to pile a whole bunch of money up on the desk. A nurse finally pleaded with me. She said, you've got to get out of here. As long as you're here, they'll do nothing for him if you're not paying them big bucks. Get out of here. Get his family in here. Let them get involved. And so I left immediately, and I sent up a church member with some pocket money to take care of our church members that were involved in that circumstance. But the fact of the matter is he stayed that way, untreated, for 4 or 5 days before they finally operated. And, of course, he died of the ensuing infection. And there are some stories, there are other stories that are just as bad, if not worse than that. So yes, when we provide health care there, number one, most of the time we're bringing in American doctors, that instant credibility. No question whatsoever that they're qualified as an American doctor coming in. In the eyes of the people, instant credibility. And we're helping them and we're giving them what they need. In recent years, we've even been able to add to that like a health education physical therapy wing to it to where, if it's the lower back, we're teaching them the things they can do is by way of lifestyle habits to keep that from getting worse. If you're getting malaria a lot, this is the reason why. So this is what you can do to avoid getting this in the future, which really seems to have taken on pretty well. But especially in the village context, we'll have people that are there forming the line at 4 o'clock in the morning, and we're not opening till 8 or 9. They'll be there. We've had people spend the night in the waiting room so that they could be seen the next day. So yeah, absolutely. And if you talk dental and optician, multiply that by 3, because for some reason those are disproportionately expensive. And if we offer free dental care or free eye care, there are going to be a lot of people. So yeah, it works amazingly well in the village context.
Wow.
Our nurse practitioner, Christine McLaughlin, has been with us since 2009, and she is now organizing, she's developed what she calls her Access program. She brings medical professionals in 2 times a year, and we target an area in the interior of the country where we have a national pastor who either wants to start a church right now or he's recently started one, and we do medical days there to bolster that work, to raise the stature of that national pastor in the eyes of his people, and he gets all those questionnaires at the end of that time of people that he can follow up on. Hey, we helped you at our clinic. You got to come visit our church. Have you thought about this? He has all their phone numbers. So very effective,
Wow.
medical work, very effective.
Now you mentioned malaria at least twice, I think, maybe 3 times. And of course, here in America, and it's a world event with this COVID-19. For here in America, this is probably the first time many people have seen a major life change because of some kind of a medical illness or virus or disease. However, in Africa, that's isn't it more routine in the sense that you deal with illness type things quite a bit more, such as malaria? You want to just address that, because that's an ongoing
Fortunately, malaria is parasitical, so there isn't any contagion with malaria. I cannot give you malaria. And praise the Lord for that, because I'll tell you, if it were contagious, it'd really be ugly. But still, it is still the number 1 killer in sub-Saharan West Africa. No doubt about that at all. Interestingly enough, those of the black race are more resistant to malaria. As I understand it, what makes them susceptible to sickle cell anemia makes them more resistant to malaria. But in some ways, that can do more harm than good, because it can cause the African to delay treating himself, thinking that he can get by without the medicine. Malaria is entirely treatable. You just have to treat it. It's not like a cold or a flu where you just wait it out and then you're okay at the end. When we sense that we may have come down with malaria, when we're symptomatic, we go right on up, we get a blood test done, we can have the result back the same day. If it's positive, then we either see the doctor, we call the doctor, he lets us know what to buy, and we immediately go on a treatment. If we're faithful to do that, we will get over the malaria. If we're not, then it can start getting complicated. But it still is very prevalent in the culture. Practically every person we would ever work with on a medical day is dealing with malaria in one way or another. Typhoid, unfortunately, is very much on the rise in the Ivory Coast. It used to be that they would test for that maybe 3rd or 4th. But today, if you walk in presenting certain symptoms, they're going to test you for malaria and typhoid immediately at the same time, because it has become that much more prevalent. That's bacterial in nature. But that does spread a lot through a community simply through situations that aren't that hygienic. Interestingly, things like flus and colds, we don't see really to the same extent out there. It's just the bacterial infections, the typhoid, the malaria, yellow fever. For the most part, we're not seeing much of that anymore. That's the kind of illnesses that we're going to be dealing with generally. Or they've had accidents, they've wounded themselves, and the wound is badly infected. We've dealt with a lot of that. One time at our clinic, we had like like a 5-month-old baby that had been badly burned in the village, and unfortunately they had treated her with ash for 5 days before they brought her to our clinic. So, that was just a very difficult circumstance to work with. So I would say that more than anything. To my knowledge, we have not had anything in the Ivory Coast that is contagious as what we're looking at for something like Ebola or coronavirus. So outside of the typical bacterial things that you could pick up, we haven't had things too much like that, not in my experiences.
Right. Okay. But still a lot more experience with illnesses compared to us.
Oh, no question. Yeah, no question. You go in for these medical days, you have to go in with a certain amount of fortitude because you're going to see cases that could have been so easily prevented, You're going to see patients that are very close to death, and there's not that much you can do about it. You have to steel yourself for those medical days. Yes, but they're so rewarding in the end. They just really are so rewarding in the end. But like Luke has functioned as a translator for years now between the American doctor and the patient. So he has seen so much even as an adolescent, by way of the things that are happening there. And so sure, why did you do this? Why didn't you treat this? And the suffering is extreme, and it could have been prevented so easily. But you just go with it and look at it as nothing other. This is what the Lord's using to bring this person to the gospel, and we're going to get the gospel to them while they're here.
Right.
So
that's some amazing ways that you've been able to reach different segments of people with the gospel.
Yeah.
But there's more to the Great Commission than just seeing people saved.
Correct.
And I haven't talked to you about this, but it sounds like you're working with nationals to help establish more churches.
Yes, we've done that twice. I'm still working with the Bangerville Church, but we've worked with nationals to establish a church up in Zana-Pledugu in the far north of the country, and then even in our last term out in the far west of the country in the city of Mach. And I think in our next term, I'm going to be turning the Bangerville Church over to a national pastor, and the vast majority of my efforts then will be in our Bible Institute and seminary, with the anticipation that I go with those graduates to help them when they start their works.
Right.
So,
Okay.
yes, church planting.
Yeah, could you say a little more about the Bible Institute
Yeah.
and the training, because that's a very important thing.
Yeah.
It's great to see people saved, but then that's the beginning of the work that God has for
Yes, absolutely. What we want are good, well-functioning, financially solvent, indigenous churches in the Ivory Coast, and that's entirely attainable. The Bangerville Church has been financially autonomous for 6-7 years now. I haven't put any money into that church. It pays all its own bills. It pays salaries. They have their Faith Promise program. They're currently supporting 3 missionaries sent out of the church and an additional 5 missionaries, so a total of 8 missionaries they're supporting on a monthly basis. So, people will say, well, you can't really expect to have financially autonomous churches in Africa. That is not true. The same biblical principles that work for us here in the States work for them in the Ivory Coast. I want to turn that over so that I can really be involved in the Institute. In the 25 years that I've been in the Ivory Coast, up until 2016, our weakest area, in my opinion, was in the area of pastoral training. We just simply were not getting it done. We were not effectively training men, and we certainly weren't training them in their understanding of what an educational process ought to be. So it didn't make sense to them, and it was insufficient. And these men would go out, and they knew that they weren't ready. But, the missionaries kind of prodding them on, get out there, get started. And I worked with 2 other institutes, and my experience in those 2 other institutes showed me what does not work. I feel like I became an absolute expert on how not to do Bible Institute Seminary in the Ivory Coast. And so in 2016, we started this in Bangerville, and I think it's very successful. We have brought in a number of people from the States and Canada and France who have taught for us, and it is a tremendous amount of work because all the syllabuses, all the written materials had to be translated into French ahead of time. And then if it's not a French-speaking professor, I have to orally translate for him for 35 hours in a week as he's teaching that class, and then take all those tests that they're taking and their projects and get all those graded and squared away and everything. It's very, very time-consuming, which is why I'm anxious to go ahead and turn the Baingerville Church over. But it's the absolute key for the future in this country. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting, in recent years, we have had more contact with the pastors out west. Bay Lazare comes to a lot of our stuff, Céry-Jean. There's even a pastor, Leah, from Blot-le-Quin that comes quite often. And we're integrating more with them. I am now having students come from Tulepleu, which is on the border with Liberia. I'm having students coming from Mali. There'll be students coming from Burkina Faso and elsewhere within the Ivory Coast to get the training that we're offering there in Baingerville. And I really believe with all my heart that this is going to allow for a better Great Commission process in the Ivory Coast.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, from here in America, our idea of university is you go to a campus and you stay there for a certain number of days. It sounds like that's not exactly the format that you're using there. So could you describe kind of how it works?
Yeah, not right now I'm not, but they have a similar concept. There's the University of Cocody that's right there in Abidjan, and by law that's the only university. But there are many colleges, they refer to them as Grande École, big schools. There are many colleges there in Abidjan that you can go to as well, private colleges. That is actually how they see it. But in their way of thinking, the internship is so much more important. Somebody might go off to college and get their degree. Maybe they're going to do an internship, maybe they aren't. In the Ivorian way of thinking, there is no education without an internship. So we've established our school, and the classes are very much college-level classes that are conducted as they would be in any other college or university. And they have a 4-year program to get to a bachelor and then a 2-year program to get to a master's. And that's what they fully expect. Now, I don't have a sitting faculty. That's what I don't have. And so that's why we've gone to a modular course structure. And every 6 weeks, we do a modular class. Starts on Monday, ends on Friday, 7 hours a day, 35 hours of class, which is reasonably comparable to what you would get in a university. So I've worked out all these classes, and they happen about once every 6 weeks, and I have them lined up. So I'm constantly in contact with who's going to be teaching in the future to get the written materials. I'm distributing those amongst our translators so they get it from English into French, and they get it back to me. Then I have to go through it line for line to ensure that they have maintained the theological integrity of what was originally written and that it is saying what it's supposed to be saying. Then get it off to another proofer who makes sure that the French itself is exactly what it ought to be, just to get that one syllabus done for that one class. And so we're constantly working on that. But then the professor comes, we go through the week, and then the professor can leave, and I handle the testing and the projects in that 6-week interlude before the next class. So it is a modular class structure, but as far as the classes themselves and what we're expecting is very much university-level stuff, college-level stuff. And
Okay.
we're expecting them to do it, and they are.
And you mentioned something about an internship.
Yes, yes.
Obviously, learning and bookwork is important, but it sounds like you're doing more than just that.
Absolutely, which makes perfect sense. I did a 4-year internship at Cleveland Baptist, and I'm not saying that a 4-year internship is necessary, but it was a great thing because it gave the Cleveland Baptist Church every opportunity to take a look at me and determine, does he really have from God what he's going to need to work in the ministry? And so when they did ordain me and send me out, they did so with confidence, and I had confidence as well because I was able to see, I was in a ministerial context, and God blessed what I was doing. But this concept is very prevalent throughout really all the French system of education, and of course that's what's influenced the Ivorian system of education. And so it is perfectly logical in their thinking that they would, for example, complete 4 years, so they've completed the academic requirements for a bachelor, but that we then send them home to their local church, and that they would work an internship under their pastor in their local church with a written practicum ready to go, so that they are having to accomplish certain things on that internship, and their pastor is having to evaluate them as far as how well they've done. And that really sets that church up then to be able to send that person out, because they know who he is and they've seen what he's done and they know that he's capable. And so, yes, the internship, very important, but we're doing all that on the local church level. And I've communicated with all the pastors of all the students that we have in our institute and seminary, and telling them we are nothing more than a help to you as a local church. Mm-hmm. And I've told all the students, I can talk with your pastor about how you're doing in this institute anytime your pastor wants to talk to me. So if he calls me up and asks me what your grades are, he's going to know. Because we're not an entity in and of ourselves. We're an institution that's helping the local church train their men so that they can effectively send them out into the ministry. So. But it's, honestly, I'm asking God to give me at least 20 more years in doing this in the Ivory Coast to have this well on its way so that it can continue for generations afterwards.
Right. Well, that's amazing to hear what God is using there. I want to talk a little bit more about missions in a general sense. Mm-hmm. Perhaps you've heard the phrase, we could all be a missionary. Mm-hmm. At home. And it's true, I can go across to my neighbor and give them the gospel. But it's also not true to say that me going across the driveway and talking to my neighbor is not the same experience as a missionary going to the foreign field.
Yeah.
So obviously we should all be a witness for Christ wherever we are.
Yes.
But what are some of the things that missionaries are involved in getting the gospel, as far as, since you're a foreign missionary, you're going to a new culture?
Mm-hmm. You know, I do firmly believe that is a biblical directive. Ephesians 4:11 called some to be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some doctors and pastors. Obviously, apostles and prophets, that's completed. Okay, that was apostolic, and that's done. Evangelist, in that context, really is implying the missionary role. It's someone who is leaving where he is to evangelize elsewhere. And so we have a concept here in the States of an evangelist as kind of like a circuit preacher going from church to church, which is fine. But that biblical word implies a little bit more the work of a missionary. And then doctor pastors, those who are pastoring churches. So when the Lord does direct a man to a foreign field full-time to evangelize and plant churches, yes, I view that as a specific calling of God, and one to which we should all be open. But it is going to require the necessary theological and ministerial training and experience in order to accomplish. Now, the big thing is when you go to another field, as I mentioned earlier, American culture is pretty unique in this world. We as Americans, our way of thinking, our culture is pretty unique. I mean, we may have some similarities with Canadians, but believe me, there's some differences. And as you head south out of the United States, it gets a whole lot more extreme very, very quickly, like right at the border. Europeans do not think the way that we do. We are rugged individualists. We only accept somebody in the group if they have established themselves as an individual. I mean, that's kind of our way of thinking. And everyone is supposed to do their own thing and take care of their own self and so on and so forth. I'd work 3 jobs at McDonald's before I'd ask someone to help me pay my bills, that kind of a thing. Now you take that and you stick that individual right in the middle of a communal community somewhere where it's not rugged individualism, it's communal in their thinking. And that American's going to be sorely challenged. So much so that, in my opinion, the reason why God is sending Americans around the world as missionaries is not because the Americans are so competent, but because if anything happens on that mission field, everyone knows it must have been God. Because that American is so poorly situated to really effectively work in that culture. I've been in the Ivory Coast 25 years. Been working so hard at loving and adopting the culture, and I do love it, and I do love the people. And even if the Lord said, Bob, you don't have to go there anymore, I'd say, we'll just keep going. We're into this, But the reality is, I stand here tonight as a 57-year-old man, 25 years in the Ivory Coast, and I'm here with my son, who's 17, who hasn't been in the Ivory Coast as long as I have, and I know that he knows 3 times, 4 times, 5 times the culture better than I do. Now, I can let that do one of two things. I can let that frustrate me, or I can simply accept that that's the case, and I can work within that structure. There are so many things that can happen in other cultures that would drive the typical American absolutely mad. And it's not that that other culture is bad, it's that the American can't, doesn't, or is resisting getting it and endeavoring to work within it and endeavoring to understand it. So is there a difference between my giving the gospel to my neighbor here in the States and my going to another country to work giving the gospel? Oh yes, yeah, there is. And you know, just learning another language. I go off to Bible college, I get my degree, I got some aviation training, I came back, I worked for 4 years in my local church, I was ordained, authorized, and sent by my local church. I go to 1-year language school. I show up in the Ivory Coast and I'm speaking French at about the level of a 4 or 5-year-old. And I know it, and everybody around me knows it. Now what am I going to do? Am I going to continue in this thing? Or am I going to let this frustrate me and I'm just going to say, I'm just going to use a translator from now on. I'm going to go home. So yes, when somebody's going to a new country, he does well to recognize exactly what he's dealing with in doing that and what he's going to need to be able to adjust to in order to succeed in doing it. Yeah, it's two different things.
Obviously, a language is a big
Huge
thing, and it can be overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned some things about the difference, is more of a philosophical difference, the communal perspective versus an individual perspective. A lot of people may not even know, like, what does that mean? Like, what would be some differences, examples perhaps, to help us understand what that means from a communal perspective?
Well, when I first got to the Ivory Coast, actually it was right when I went to Bangerville, because I worked with another missionary in the Ivory Coast, so there was already a presence there, and he'd already gone through a lot of this. But when I first went to Bangerville, I mean, listen, immediately, an American comes into a town like Bangerville, everyone in that town knows it within a week. There's an American living here. All right. Very quickly, I got to the point, I remember slamming the door, walking into the house, and screaming practically at the top of my lungs, I'm putting 2 plaques on our gate. The first plaque is going to say, this house is not an extension of the SJBCE Bank of Abidjan. And number 2, this house is not an extension of the consular services of the U.S. Embassy in Abidjan, because I'm constantly being hit up for money and visa help. As an American, that drives us nuts, you know. Growing up, if I had a need, I was trained to do what it took for me to meet that need. All right? I'm supposed to take care of myself. I am a sluggard. I am lazy. I am whatever if I just assume that I can walk up to people and ask them to help me financially or this, that, or anything else. Why? Because that's our culture. As Americans, we are rugged individualists. That's how we are. In a communal society, if I have a problem, in a sense, yes, it's my problem, but it's my community's problem. And in a sense, I'm being benevolent when I bring my community in and allow them to help me with that problem. You know, I'll never forget, I just was getting overwhelmed with this, getting mad. I could sense a certain bitterness coming in. I'm thinking, I cannot be bitter with the people that God's called me to. I got to get a handle on this. So I went to see one of our national pastors, who has really been a mentor for me by way of culture in the Ivory Coast. And I just asked him right out, I said, do your people ever ask you for money? He goes, oh yeah. And I was shocked. I said, serious? They ask you for money? Because I thought I'm just getting it because I'm the American. He goes, oh yeah. Well, you see, I said, oh, wow. Well, how do you handle that? And so I just saw him on a number of occasions where we just sat down and we talked about this. He told me about things I could do. Number one, you never give the money right when they ask for it. You thank them for having shared that with you, and you let them go. It gives you time to think about it. And number two, they're not offended if you don't help them. You come to a reason why that's maybe not for you, you can share that with them. There's other people in their community. And he just went on and he was explaining so many things to me that I really, with time, began to kind of understand it, you know. So every time they were showing up asking me, I wasn't so offended. Now, the problem is there are plenty of escrows, con people out there. That's for sure. And you get to learn that after a while, too. And so you just work through that. But it will not take long for an American missionary to think these are the laziest, no good people I have ever seen in my entire life, and they are absolutely wrong in that evaluation. And so communal living is different. So if I have a need, I'd be quick to share that with you, you know. Maybe you're going to want to be a part of that, maybe you aren't going to want to be a part of it, but you're not offended by the fact that I'm sharing that with you in a communal society. You know, in a communal society, you're nobody if you're not a member of the group. It doesn't matter if you're a billionaire. If you haven't established yourself as a member of the group, as far as that group is concerned, you're nobody. It's like 180 degrees opposed. And it'll manifest itself in a lot of different ways. If I come today to borrow your lawnmower, and you loan me your lawnmower, when I'm done with it, what am I going to do? I'm going to fill up the gas tank, and I'm going to clean that thing off, and I'm going to bring it back. I'm going to say, Brother Townsley, thanks so much. It was a great help. But I mean, it ought to be mutually beneficial if I got to use it, so I'm going to give you the gas, and I'm going to clean the thing up. You know, something along that line. Well, in the Ivory Coast, if I were to do that, if I borrowed your lawnmower and I brought it back ceremoniously and gave it back to you and the gas tank's full and I cleaned it all up, what I would be saying to you is I thought my relationship with you was so weak that it could be lost over a lawnmower, and you would be devastated that I felt like I needed to do that. Now that's an entirely different way of thinking, see? So when I loan my machete to a national and he brings it back and it looks like he found every rock in that field with my machete, and I'm wondering why he didn't file those nicks out. He didn't file them out. His not filing them out demonstrates that he's very secure in his relationship with me. It is an entirely different way of thinking. And you'll either get a hold of that or you won't, you know. I don't know how, I've heard missionaries been on the field 15, 20 years say, bless God, you borrowed something from somebody, you ought to give it back in as good as or better condition than when you got it. I mean, that's character, Bible character. And in effect, what he said, you borrow something from a friend, violate that relationship with him. That's what he said. He still doesn't know it. So it's challenging. The differences are challenging. You have to work very hard at understanding what is going through their mind and their thinking.
Well, and that's just the culture, and that's just one aspect
exactly.
of the culture.
Yeah.
And that says nothing about the language or the food or all the other things.
Absolutely.
So,
yes, sir.
wow. That's a real help to understand. So that's why we need to pray for our missionaries.
Yes, you do. You do. But God is faithful, you know. Is there work in the Ivory Coast? There is, yes. Is that because of me? It is simply because I was willing to go. God has clearly done the rest. Because you take somebody from Cleveland, Ohio, suburban west side of Cleveland, Ohio, and slap him down in the Ivory Coast, you simply cannot expect by any logical means that he's going to be able to effectively work in that culture. So if the work was done, it was God. I try to be as best tool as I can be in his hands, and hopefully after 25 years I'm a tad bit sharper than I was when I first got there, but still, if it gets done, it has to be God. And I've really come to that conclusion. That's the reason why he's doing it, is because we are unique as a culture here in the world. And so if we go somewhere to start a work and the work succeeds, it has to have been God.
Amen. One more question. This is more a general question. It seems like, from my perspective, that we need more missionaries
Yes.
around the world. We
Yeah.
need more churches started here in the United States as well. So where are all these people? Could you address something about, for example, the church you're from? I know a little bit about it. My guess is you're not the only person who grew up in that church. Why is it there are some churches nobody ever does anything for God in full-time Christian service? And then there are other churches, it seems like, for some reason, God's calling more people from some churches and nobody from another church. Is that a coincidence, or what do you think is the reason?
No, that's an excellent question. And let me say at the beginning, obviously that is somewhat of a subjective question. You're soliciting my opinion on that, and I'm more than willing to give it to you. It's entirely possible that somebody listening to me would not agree at all with what I'm saying, which is fine. But for me personally, I think to a large degree, we do well when we remove the mysticism about God's call. It's kind of funny. I remember when I was on deputation, I'm in all these missions conferences, and we're all supposed to give our testimonies how the Lord called us to our field, which is great. But, sometimes you get a bunch of deputizing missionaries together, and it gets a little competitive, and, everyone's seeking to get the support of that church, and so it seemed like some of those testimonies got rather spectacular about what God did to call them to the field, and I'd get in the car and we'd drive out there, and I'd just look over at Becky and I'd say, Becky, I'm really sorry. I don't got a testimony like that, but I just feel like we're doing what the Lord has us to do. Sometimes there just seems to be a lot of mysticism behind that. Like, we're in the missions conference and God's call is floating in the air, and we're waiting to see on who it's going to plop. Anytime we say that we know something, we ought to be able to give a good Bible explanation as to how we know that. So if you ask me, how do I know that the Lord wants me in the Ivory Coast? I'm going to answer that by saying, because the Apostle Paul said to Timothy, he that desireth the work of a bishop desireth a good thing. He didn't say he that is called. He said he that desireth. Okay? That's intriguing that he chose that word. Secondly, unto whom much is given, much is required. If we have a group of kids that have grown up in a church and have had the luxury as well as a Christian education, we should be expecting that many of them end up in full-time service. So I think the key there is to demystify this as best we can and say, listen, God wants laborers in the field. Rather than sitting around wondering if you're called, why don't you go before God and ask Him, God, look at what you've given me in my life. If you want me in another country, I will go. If you want me to another area of the United States to start a church, I will go. I'll do this. And as well, the real teaching that we get out of Ephesians 4 is the fact that leadership is a gift of God to local churches, and God has prepared them for that work. When I was talking about the internship earlier, I think that's critical. A young man says he feels that the Lord's calling him to Africa. Marvelous. He goes off somewhere else and gets 4 years of training somewhere else. That's very good. But really, before this church should ordain and authorize him to send him out, he ought to be coming back, and they ought to be able to look at him and say, yes, he can effectively organize and administrate. He can teach effectively. He does give good biblical counsel. He demonstrates care and compassion for people. We're seeing these things in him. He has these gifts of God. Therefore, we can confirm that God is directing him to that country and send him out. So I think local churches that view it that way, where yes, it is a matter of God's plan for an individual life, what He does, but that doesn't have to be mystical. Let's be very open about this. We're praying for laborers to go to the field. We think that God would come here to find laborers. Young people, open your hearts. Ask God. Get before Him on your knees. Ask God why He wouldn't use you as a pastor or missionary. Ask Him why. If you have a desire, head in that direction and see what God does. I don't think the devil's going to give you a desire for the pastorate or for missionary work. So if you have a desire, start moving that way. A person moving is more easily directed than a person sitting still, And I think in that way, it will help young people to really think more seriously about this, rather than saying, well, I know of a particular case, where I'd love to be a youth pastor, but I haven't sensed that God has called me to do that. Well, what would you do if you weren't a youth pastor? Well, I don't know. I really want to be a youth pastor. Oh, but I mean, you don't have another sense like accounting or construction or, no, those things don't interest me. I really like to be a youth pastor, but I just don't think God, my advice to that kid is get on down to Bible college and be a youth ministries major and let's see where this goes, Mm-hmm. So, anyway, I hope that answers your question.
Yes, and I know I said the last question, but one more question.
Yeah. No, I'll stand here all night. I love
what-
this. Sorry for you out there in TV land. We will.
Yes. Well, they can go and rewatch it later.
Yeah,
It's
they
gonna
can see
be
it later,
archived.
yeah.
So, what do you do all day as a missionary when you're on the field?
To a large degree, that's going to depend on the country. You're asking me about my
Just-
life.
yeah, more
Yeah,
specific.
it's rare. It's really not often that I have 2 days that are exactly the same. Number one, in a country like the Ivory Coast, it takes so much more time just to live. If we're going to keep our house clean and managed, if we're going to prepare 3 meals a day, we live on a dirt road, and everything is cooked from scratch in the Ivory Coast. There's no processed food. So just to live as a family in that spot is going to take so much more time. And homeschooling is much more prevalent out there. So our kids were homeschooled. So not only am I saying to my wife, keep a house clean that's on a dirt road and fix 3 meals from scratch a day, but train the kids too, We're going to have to find ways to make that doable, So there have been ladies in the church that have worked with my wife, with the house, with Morgan, with the food, so that my wife can be down there as much as necessary to oversee the kids' training, school training. That's just the way it's going to be. If I, as somebody in the ministry, actually want to have time to prepare for the ministry and to do it, then I'm going to need some help in some areas too. It always amazes me. We come home on furlough, and our church in Cleveland has a house right next door that they let us stay in. It always amazes me how easy it is to be in that house and how little time we have to spend doing stuff around it, It's difficult to explain, but I'm just telling you, you go to a third world country, so much more time just to live. So you're going to have to find ways. Secondly, in our culture, time is precious. Time is money. And I'm insulting you if I'm not considering your time. Yeah, just throw that away. When I first went out to the Ivory Coast back in the day, the early 90s, the big thing was the day timer, where you could, and I had the model that divided my day into 15-minute increments. And in my internship, I'm telling you, every day I had that thing filled out. I knew exactly what I was doing and when I was doing it. I took that with me to the Ivory Coast. After a month, I had to hold a burial service for that day timer in my backyard. Literally, I had to do something ceremonial to make this clear to me. I can no longer live this way. So I maintain a list of things that I need to be getting done, but I don't put any time increments to those because I can so rarely predict how long something's actually going to take. The electric bill comes to the house. Well, once that comes to the house, I'm going to want to pay that as quickly as I can because the longer I wait, the longer the line gets at the electric company because most of the people will procrastinate to closer to the due date. So if I'm smart, I'm going to get down there as fast as I can. So the bill's coming to the house, all right, so I'm going to go down there to pay it, and I get down there, and there's a sign there in the cash that says, we're not open today. Now, of course, the normal sign says that they are, and they are, in fact, supposed to be. But here's this cardboard sign stuck up there, we're not here today. And I'm just supposed to accept that. Now I'm returning home after having wasted that half hour, and now I got to do that half hour again tomorrow, hoping that somebody's there in the window. But you see, it's not going to irritate an Ivorian that way. See? So it's rare that I have 2 days in a row that really are very much the same. It's depending on my list structure. I have a list for things that I need to do around the house, for the house. I have a list of things that I need to accomplish with my family. I have a list of things for the church, and I have a list of things for the Bible Institute. And what I'm doing in a day is depending on where the priority is in all those lists. Yeah. So it's very, very different. I haven't been 9 to 5 for 28 years. Very, very different. But I will say this, I am very conscious of time that I'm spending in the ministry, and I am ensuring that I'm full-time in the ministry. It's just that it may not come in the normal 9 to 5 hours.
Right.
So,
Especially if you have other people that you need to do certain things,
mhm.
because they'll get to it at some point, right?
You know, there are times where things have to be done in Abidjan. Today, for me to go from Beijville to Abidjan, that's going to take an hour and a half because of the traffic. It's unbelievable. You wouldn't believe it. It's unbelievable in Abidjan now. Hour and a half to get there, hour and a half to get back. That's 3 hours. And then however long it's going to take me to do that one thing. If I have a national that's perfectly capable of doing that for me, why wouldn't I use him? I'll give him the transport money. I'll give him the money he needs to get it done. And when he gets back, I'll give him something for his time. That helps him. That helps me. I just gained at least 3 hours, 4 hours to continue doing something ministerially. So you do have to start thinking that way. And some people in their personalities, and I do have a tendency this way, you know, my grandfather always told me, if you want something done right, do it yourself. So, I mean, delegations, originally, when I first got out there, kind of challenging for me. It's like, no, I really need to do everything. I need to make sure it's done right. Well, you better get over that one, too. Because if you're going to accomplish all that you would like to, you're going to have to get some help. Because this society just does not operate the same way. You know, I can go up to the phone company. I say I go up to Orange. My cell phone company's Orange. I go in there, and they'll say, oh, our system's down. Okay, yeah, just come back tomorrow. As if just coming back tomorrow was the only thing I had on my list of things to do for tomorrow. You know, okay, I came today, all right? So, yeah, you just have to work with those things. But as time goes on, another thing I will say is the Lord sends you somewhere, He'll give you the people there to help you. That's been my experience.
Amen. Praise the Lord. All right, well, that's been a lot of more general things about the ministry and the specifics, and try to find out a little bit more tomorrow as far as how God led you.
Mm-hmm.
Luke, if you wouldn't mind, got a few questions for you as well. I appreciate you coming. This is great. And just stand right there so everybody can hear you. I'm so glad you came, and it's such a blessing. I'll ask you the same question. So what do you do all day, and is it really any different than what you think average kid in America would do?
Well, because everything there is done in French, all the school systems, I've been homeschooled my whole life. And so my whole day is just basically doing homeschooling. We do the Abeka program, the videos. And I just wake up at 8 o'clock, I start, and I take an hour break at lunch, and then I go to 3. And then on Wednesdays, you know, we have church. Sundays we have church, and I'm in the ministry there. But that's just basically what my normal day looks like. It's just school.
So
My mom keeps me busy.
A lot of school and probably meals and
Yes, sir.
some stuff around the house.
And then after school hours, I grew up in the basketball center, and so I have, you know, players that I played with for several years, and I go there every Wednesday afternoons before church, and you know, different activities like that I've been able to be involved in. That've been really awesome.
And then you came to church.
And then I came to church.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
And church activities?
We have, so it's kind of interesting. Our youth group, we're not able to have youth group activities throughout the whole year. So what they do is they gear up for 1 or 2 big activities every year. So at Christmas and at New Year's, we have a big competition where the youth group divides itself into different groups, and they all compete in areas of Bible knowledge, music, and different things like that. And so throughout the year, we're all getting ready for our different competitions. And so after Sunday morning, I'll stay at church a little bit longer to work with my group that I'm assigned to, and we have different activities like that we're able to do.
Right. Now, I would guess that you've probably helped with some things in the church.
Mhm.
What are some different ministries or ways you've helped?
Well, when I started expressing interest in coming back to the Ivory Coast full time, I started talking to my dad about that, and he said, well, what you need to do is you need to make sure that you're walking in the Spirit. If you're walking in the Spirit, you know that you are doing what the Lord would have you to do every day. Then the Lord will help show you what He wants you to do in the future. And so he said, you need to get involved as much as you can. And so that's what I started doing. I started teaching in the 5 to 8-year-old Sunday school class. I became a regular teacher. I taught every other Sunday. I started singing in the choir, and that was a feat of itself because they have very strict guidelines in order to join there. And I was able to go through the process, and I joined the choir. And then also my brother started a deaf ministry. a deaf Sunday school class, and I started helping with that, and we'd meet with the deaf Sunday afternoons. And so I started getting involved as much as I could in those activities and youth group activities.
Welcome committee.
And the welcoming committee. It's kind of funny. My dad has started different committees in the church to just help the church function properly, and I joined the welcoming committee. And they're big into wearing these vests. So we're at the entrances of the church property, and they like to wear these bright yellow vests so that everyone knows that when they come in, they need to see them so they can welcome them and show them where to go. And so every Sunday morning, I put on my vest with my friends in the welcoming committee, and I've just been involved in those different areas in our ministry, and it's been awesome.
Amen. When people think about Africa, people think of it kind of like, some people in America think Africa is like the worst possible thing that could ever happen to someone, and it would be a terrible experience. Your perspective is a little different because would it be safe to assume you feel more comfortable in Africa than you do here in the United States?
I would say that, yes, because I grew up there. I know the culture maybe even a little better than I know the culture here. And, for me, it's normal everyday life just to wake up there, and I enjoy it. And I recognize that for a foreigner, it can seem very intimidating and very unusual and very frightening. But once you get into the culture and you understand the people, like my dad was saying, and you understand why they think what they think, it becomes very natural. And that intimidating factor goes away, and you learn to enjoy it.
Right, and a lot of people think if you go to Africa as a missionary, you're going to be missing a whole bunch of things. But what are some things you'll be missing if you stay here in America that you just can't experience or you don't have?
Well, I've been able to help in those medical days, and I've seen, things there that the Lord has taught me that I never would have learned if I was just going to a regular school in the States. Those medical days, we have different competitions among, doctors on who can see the most patients in a day. But what is always more encouraging is when the person who comes from the counseling center is saying, hey, we have 15 people saved today.
Mm-hmm.
You know what? I can see a few more patients. That's kind of exciting. They come back later, hey, we have 30 people saved today.
Amen.
It just keeps you going. I never would have had that if I didn't grow up there. As well, I've met so many more people because I've lived there, but I also come back on to the States on furlough. And it's given me so many more opportunities to meet different people. I feel like it's given me more ministerial opportunities. That's really allowed me to see that the Lord has a place for me there. And so, really, it may be easy for me as a missionary kid to think that I'm being left out of certain things because I didn't grow up in the States. But honestly, I see it the complete opposite way. The Lord has given me many more opportunities than I normally would have had.
Right, and that's, of course, assuming everything in America is great,
Exactly.
which isn't really the case.
Yes, sir.
Okay, well, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
And Luke's going to be teaching kids class tomorrow, so we're looking forward to that for our young people. And tomorrow, don't forget, for those of you, hopefully some of these questions have generated some more specific questions on your own for those watching. And so if you haven't already, please contact me, call the church number, be able to schedule a time where you could follow up on these things and ask some more things about the missionaries. Okay, thank you so much.
3 hours. Huh? Oui, bien sûr. Ouais, ouais, ouais.